Since May 2024, Russian forces have relentlessly pressed their assault toward Vovchansk in Ukraine's Kharkiv region. This border city has been reduced to rubble by intense artillery barrages and tank attacks, transforming what was once a bustling town into a wasteland of destruction. Yet Russia has failed to capture Vovchansk. The reason is clear. Ukrainian forces have destroyed nearly all of Russia's armored vehicles in the sector. Putin's troops are now forced to advance on foot into the city, facing near-certain death as the Kremlin refuses to admit total failure. Of course, if one only followed Moscow's constant claims that Ukraine stands on the brink of collapse, this grim reality would remain hidden.
Russia seeks to convince the world that its tanks are rolling from one city to the next, devastating Ukraine along the way, in a war that will ultimately leave a shattered nation under Putin's control. The situation at Vovchansk tells a starkly different story. Russian tanks cannot advance, nor can their armored vehicles. According to Euromaidan Press, since the summer of 2025, Russia has been unable to mount any effective mechanized assault against Ukrainian defenses in this Kharkiv region city. The explanation is straightforward. Russia's armored forces have been depleted.
All that remains in the Vovchansk axis are abandoned vehicles left behind after Russian failures against Ukrainian troops in their drones. The role of drones and their devastating impact will be addressed shortly. First, the current picture at Vovchansk must be clarified. The Kremlin has abandoned mechanized attacks and shifted to small infantry assault groups targeting the city. These groups are described as stealthy and capable of infiltration. However, every meter of Ukrainian ground they seize comes at enormous cost in lives, raising the obvious question, why commit such small units? Before answering that, comment number 2 if you support Ukraine, number 3 if you support Russia, and number 4 if you love peace.
Russia's strategy at Vovchansk follows a twisted logic, not solely because its armor is exhausted. Beginning in mid-2025, Moscow shifted to small infantry units to seize Ukrainian territory through irregular means. It abandoned the traditional mechanized approach, once characterized by attempts to smash Ukrainian lines with tanks and armored vehicles that had inflicted severe equipment losses. These small units are designed to slip through Ukrainian defenses. As Business Insider reported in October 2025, the concept relies on their low profile to evade the constant patrols of Ukrainian FPV and reconnaissance drones operating in the dangerous no-man's land between Russian positions and Ukrainian lines. Business Insider also noted that Russian infantry is guided by their own drones, advancing cautiously along forward lines in hopes of finding gaps in Ukrainian defenses. If infiltration teams locate such gaps, they slip through and attempt to consolidate positions behind enemy lines, aiming to hold until reinforcements arrive, while sowing as much chaos as possible in Ukraine's rear.
This is a clever tactic, but only to a limited degree. According to Ukrainian serviceman Artem, former deputy commander of Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade, who spoke to Business Insider in October 2025, Russian small units often use tents and natural terrain for concealment. When moving, they follow strict orders from commanders. Once they believe a safe route is established, Russia attempts to push in more troops. The problem is that Ukrainian drones almost always detect these infiltrators, either deep in the rear or long before they reach it. Ukrainian forces must divert resources to eliminate them, and in most cases, the Russians are ultimately wiped out. Yet that outcome aligns with Russia's plan.
Putin appears indifferent to the fate of these small infantry units. If they are detected and destroyed, it still forces Ukraine to disperse attention and expend valuable ammunition. If they go undetected, Russia gains real progress. Forces News has reported that some Russian infiltrators have committed war crimes by disguising themselves as civilians, making detection harder for Ukraine. Blurring the line between Russian soldiers and Ukrainian civilians facilitates ambushes and occasionally tricks Ukrainian troops into firing on their own people. As noted, Russia's strategy in places like Vovchansk contains twisted logic. However, these small units are losing effectiveness, and the reasons will soon become apparent.
Currently, Russian small unit attacks on Vovchansk continue relentlessly, even if they achieve little. On February 2, 2026 alone, Ukrinform reported that Russia launched 11 assaults in the southern Slobozhanщина area, which includes Vovchansk. The reason for such frequent attacks, despite relying on soldiers sneaking in on foot and often facing inevitable death, is that Putin is determined to seize Vovchansk. He will keep driving Russian forces to capture the city, no matter how degraded the units become. Vovchansk is not Putin's clearest priority. Located in northern Kharkiv region on Ukraine's border, it lies far from the main fighting in Donetsk.
Donetsk is Putin's true objective, where he aims to seize both Donetsk and Luhansk to secure full control of the Donbass. So are the attacks on Vovchansk merely a diversion? Yes, but not to mislead Russian forces themselves. Since May 2024, Russia has used assaults on Vovchansk to compel Ukraine to shift troops away from Donetsk. Make no mistake, Russia certainly wants the railroad line running from Russia's Belgorod region through Vovchansk to Kupiansk, but that line is not the top priority now. Instead, anything Russia can do to pin Ukrainian troops, especially drone operating units, away from the Donetsk front is a win for Putin.
However, past events have influenced the Kremlin's decisions at Vovchansk. As mentioned, the city sits on the border, and Russia quickly learned how vulnerable such areas are when Ukraine launched its incursion into Kursk region in August 2024. It took Russia months and tens of thousands of troops to expel a relatively small Ukrainian force from its own territory in Kursk, and Putin has no desire to repeat that humiliation. The embarrassed damaged his image as a strong leader inside Russia. Losing 62,400 troops to retake Kursk was not in Putin's plans, creating a massive manpower gap that needs filling. Russia fears another Ukrainian counteroffensive, which brings the focus back to Vovchansk.
Its proximity to the Ukraine-Russia border makes the city a potential launch pad for future incursions into Russian territory. According to the New Voice of Ukraine, in June 2025, Russia hoped to turn Vovchansk into part of a so-called buffer zone between Russian and Ukrainian territory to prevent Ukraine from repeating its Kursk operation in Belgorod. That explains why Russia has destroyed roughly 90% of Vovchansk per the source. Major Taras Berezovets, a spokesman for Ukraine's territorial defense forces, explained Russia's strategy to the New Voice of Ukraine. We can only call this place a settlement in name only, as less than 10% of the homes remain standing. This reveals Russia's criminal tactic of creating what must be repeated, a buffer zone. In reality, it means raising everything, following the same script seen in Bakhmut and Soledar during enemy assaults in 2023. That is why Putin persists with attacks on Vovchansk, regardless of his forces' condition. And indeed, Russian forces are in dire straits. Out of armor and forced to attack on foot, the reality on the ground is far removed from the invincible invading army Putin seeks to project. Drones have obliterated Russian armor at Vovchansk, and now they target the unfortunate soldiers attempting to infiltrate.
The situation at Vovchansk demonstrates that capturing the city, even in its ruined state, is nearly impossible for Russia due to its inability to launch mechanized assaults. The time since Russia's last mechanized push is far longer than assumed. In an interview with Ukraine's Army TV YouTube channel, Ruslana Bogdan, communications officer of Ukraine's 57th Separate Mechanized Infantry Brigade, revealed the dire state of Russian armor at Vovchansk. Mechanized assaults have been impossible since summer. At least the last time we saw an attempt at a mechanized assault was around then. The last time Bogdan referred to was summer 2025, when Russia began trying to make Vovchansk part of its buffer zone, a goal still unachieved after more than 6 months.
Bogdan added, "Of course, drones stop them all, so using vehicles here is ineffective. BTRs or anything for moving infantry simply don't work. Even cars can't. Drones have eliminated Russia's ability to mount mechanized assaults at Vovchansk." In a February 2, 2026 article, United 24 media described Ukraine's effective drone use as a remote-controlled revolution, reporting that Russia has been forced to abandon tanks in situations like Vovchansk. The situation has grown so severe that domestic Russian analysts are calling for a complete overhaul of military doctrine, according to Defense Express.
They argue that the era of tanks as the backbone of Russian assaults must end. Russia needs to catch up to Ukraine in unmanned systems, as tanks and armored vehicles have become prime targets for Ukrainian FPV drones. The statistics tell the story. 2 sets of figures stand out, one from 1945 and one from Ukraine itself. The first reports that Russia's war in Ukraine has cost the Kremlin 4,300 tanks and 8,700 infantry fighting vehicles. Naturally, this covers the entire theater, not just Vovchansk, but it illustrates what has happened to Russian forces there, compelling the shift to infantry-only attacks. For those familiar with Ukraine's figures, the 1945 numbers may seem low, though still staggering. That's because 1945 draws from Oryx, an open-source intelligence platform that logs losses only with photo or video evidence.
Oryx also notes that actual destroyed or lost Russian equipment far exceeds what can be documented, meaning thousands more tanks and armored vehicles have been turned to scrap across Ukrainian battlefields. Ukraine's finance ministry states that Russia has lost over 11,600 tanks and nearly 24,000 armored combat vehicles since Putin's invasion began. The ministry also estimates the financial damage. Ukraine has destroyed more than $18 billion worth of Russian tanks and about $14.3 billion in armored vehicles.
It's unclear exactly how Ukraine's finance ministry calculates these losses, but even the most skeptical observers acknowledge that Russia's scale of attrition falls somewhere between Oryx and Ukrainian figures. That still equates to thousands, if not tens of thousands, of armored units destroyed over 4 years. Suddenly, the reason Russia has no tanks or armored vehicles left for assaults on Vovchansk becomes painfully clear.
Russia's pivot to infantry-only attacks is likely a direct consequence of these losses. But before examining how those attacks are failing, there is another ironic outcome from Ukraine's destruction of Russian armor. In September 2025, iStories published a revealing article noting that Russia lost far fewer vehicles in summer 2025 than in previous years of Putin's invasion. This coincided with Russia's shift to small infantry infiltration units into Ukrainian settlements, and it explains the drop. It wasn't due to brilliant strategy. Sending soldiers on foot without armor virtually guarantees their destruction. According to iStories, Russia lost fewer vehicles because it had fewer to send into battle. There is a clear explanation for the reduction in Russian armored vehicle losses. They are being used far less, iStories wrote in September 2025. This began long ago. By late 2023, after losing hundreds of vehicles near Avdiivka, Russian forces stopped mass use of tanks and armored vehicles there and shifted to infantry assault tactics. Though Russia eventually took Avdiivka, it appears to have adopted a similar approach now seen at Vovchansk. What began with mechanized assaults halted due to armor depletion. Then Russia was forced to infantry tactics. At Avdiivka and elsewhere, this worked because attacks came early in the war, when Russia still had reserves.
Even after armor ran out, destroyed tanks and vehicles had inflicted enough damage on Ukrainian lines for infantry to advance. That has not happened at Vovchansk. Russian armor was depleted far faster, and infantry must attack dismounted. This strategy is costing Putin and his army dearly. According to Euromaidan Press, Russia has spent over 600 days continuously assaulting Vovchansk since May 2024, paying with more than 15,000 troops. To put it in perspective, that's roughly 25 soldiers per day since the campaign began, perfectly matching Russia's tactic of sending small infantry groups on foot into Vovchansk. Some achieve minor gains, allowing operations in the gray zone Bogdan mentioned, but most share the fate of Russian armor, destroyed by Ukrainian drones.
The situation at Vovchansk shows Russia retains a significant manpower advantage per Euromaidan Press. Without armor, however, it cannot exploit that edge. Russia sends troops in small packets because it knows large assaults would be annihilated quickly, turning already heavy losses at Vovchansk into catastrophe. Tactically, Russia has made major shifts. In January 2025, Russian forces still engaged Ukrainian troops directly amid Vovchansk's ruins. Now they have withdrawn from the city. The reason? Fear, stemming from the lack of armor.
Currently, Russian soldiers are attempting to bypass Vovchansk, apparently to push deeper into Kharkiv region. But like direct assaults on the city, this proves ineffective. Those trying to flank still move on foot, meaning they can be eliminated by drones within minutes of detection. Vovchansk may have lost 90% of its civilian structures to Russian destruction, but the defenders' spirit and skill remain unbroken. All Russia can do is compel increasingly exhausted troops to attack a city no longer worth capturing. Worse still, Russia cannot even count on winter for aid. The frozen rivers at Vovchansk have thawed, creating major disadvantages for Putin's forces. Elsewhere in Ukraine, the legendary General Winter is inflicting damage on Russian offensives no less than Ukrainian troops themselves. Comment number 2 if you support Ukraine, number 3 if you support Russia, and number 4 if you love peace.